Chapters 29 and 30 of Napoleon and Josephine, The Rise of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 29. 1809 to 1810. Josephine at Malmaison. In fixing the dowry of Josephine, the Emperor had not been content with the amount of 2,000,000 francs granted her under the Constitution of the Empire from the State Treasury. By decree, he assured her from the Crown Treasury an additional allowance of 1,000,000 francs. By a second decree, he gave her for life the use of the Palais de l'Élysée; and by a third sovereign act he renounced in her favor all his title and interest in Malmaison. By these acts the Emperor had more than redeemed his promise to assure her future. In Paris, Josephine had for her residence the most sumptuous and the most attractive of the imperial palaces, and at the gates of the capital a château of her own choice, furnished to suit her own taste. So far from being a drain on her resources, the woods and lands of Malmaison in 1809 brought in a net revenue which exceeded by 50% the cost of its upkeep. Aside from her magnificent allowance of 3 millions, and her valuable collection of jewels, however, Josephine had no private fortune. Napoleon knew by experience that the Empress must have some debts, and he now demanded a detailed statement of the amounts. She was forced to admit that these had accumulated since the last previous liquidation 3 years before, and now reached a total of nearly 2 millions. After a careful examination of the accounts, the amount was reduced by around 500,000, and the balance was paid by the Emperor with the understanding that 1/2 the sum should be deducted from her allowance for each of the 2 following years. By this arrangement the income of the Empress was reduced to a little more than 2 millions for the first 2 years. Having paid her debts and provided her with an ample allowance, Napoleon now arranged a careful budget for Josephine's expenses in the future, but his past experience with her should have taught him how useless it was to try to curb her mania for spending. Josephine arrived at Malmaison after the close of the short December day, under a cold, penetrating rain. She was accompanied by Eugène and Hortense, who did their best to cheer and console their mother in her new situation. The disposition shown by some members of her household to desert her was checked by the Emperor, who gave express orders that they were all to continue their services until the end of the year. The first day at Malmaison was sad and depressing. The rain continued to fall without ceasing. In the morning Josephine was constantly in tears, provoked by the sight of the places where she had lived so long with the Emperor. At an early hour Napoleon sent one of his officers from the Trianon in search of news. "He tells me," Napoleon writes, "that since you are at Malmaison your courage has failed you. Nevertheless, the place is full of souvenirs of our affections which can never change, at least on my part. I am very anxious to see you, but I must be sure that you are strong and not weak. I am also a little weak myself, and that pains me much." At the Trianon the Emperor was surrounded by Pauline and her friends, who did their best to amuse him and distract his thoughts. It was impossible to walk or drive or hunt in the rain. The only recourse was a game of cards, of which Napoleon soon tired. He ordered his carriage and drove rapidly to the Tuileries. On his way back in the afternoon he stopped to visit Josephine at Malmaison. Between the showers they walked in the park together as of old, but he only shook her hand when he came and went, and did not kiss her. On his return to the Trianon he wrote her: 8 P.M., 17 December, 1809. Mon ami, I found you to-day weaker than you should have been. You have shown courage, and you must find enough to sustain you. You must not allow yourself to lapse into a fatal melancholy. You must become content, and above all guard your health, which is so precious to me. If you are attached to me, and you love me, you must bear yourself with strength and become happy. You cannot doubt my constant and tender friendship, and you little know all my regard for you if you can imagine that I can be happy if you are not, and contented if you are not tranquil. Adieu, mon ami. Sleep well. Think that I wish it. Napoleon. The second day at Malmaison passed in much the same way. The rain continued with a high wind, and it was impossible for Josephine to seek distraction by walking in the park. Eugène's efforts to cheer her up with a forced gaiety were of no avail. After déjeuner there were many callers. With every new visitor who came to pay his respects or express his regrets, there was a new flood of tears. But in her grief Josephine displays her usual tact. Not a word de trop, not a harsh complaint, falls from her lips. She is really as sweet as an angel. At Paris the reports of her attitude produced an excellent effect. Every one pitied her, and admired her courage and resignation. On the 18th the Emperor in the rain hunted in the forest of St. Germain, and sent no less than 3 times to demand news of Josephine. The following day, before departing for the hunt, he sent Savary to see the Empress. Not content with writing, and receiving her letters, he wished to have the report of a person in whom he had entire confidence. On his return he found a letter from Josephine, and immediately wrote her. 7 P.M., 19 December, 1809. I have your letter, mon ami. Savary tells me that you are constantly crying. That is not right. I hope that you have been able to take a walk to day. I have sent you some of my bag. I will come to see you when you assure me that you are reasonable and that your courage has got the upper hand. To morrow I have the ministers here all day. Adieu, mon ami. I, too, am melancholy to day. I want to hear that you are satisfied, and to learn of your self-possession. Sleep well. Napoleon. The following day the Emperor wanted to visit her, but he is very busy and a little indisposed. The weather also is damp and unhealthy. But during the day the sun comes out, and at night he writes again. As the day has been fine, I hope that you have been out to see your plants. I have only been out for a short time, at 3 o'clock this afternoon, to shoot some hares. Josephine had indeed been out for the first time. Madame de Rémusat, who had constituted herself Josephine's moral and physical director, had persuaded the Empress to take some exercise, thinking that a little fatigue might repose her mind. As M. Masson well remarks, "If Josephine had been willing to travel for a time, to go to Milan or Rome, she might little by little have lessened the pain of her downfall. But so near to Paris and the Trianon at every moment the same feelings are renewed. A note or some attention from the Emperor, a face familiar at the Tuileries, a page, a servant, a soldier, all furnish an occasion for a new outbreak." The Emperor himself was largely responsible for this state of affairs. Through pity for Josephine, also from weakness on his own part, he had not commanded her to go away, and in thus prolonging the agony of the separation he was suffering as much as the Empress from being so near and yet so far. Madame de Rémusat, taking advantage of the fact that her husband was on duty at Trianon, wrote him to hint to the Emperor that he should write the Empress in such a manner as to encourage her, and not in the evening, for his letters give her nights of anguish; also to moderate in his letters his expressions of regret and grief. The Emperor evidently took this advice in good part, for his future letters were more manly. On the 23rd December he wrote: "I should have come to see you to day, but for the arrival of the King of Bavaria. I hope to see you to morrow, and to find you gay and self-possessed." He visited her as promised, but although affectionate and tender in his manner, he did not kiss Josephine, and was not alone with her a moment. The following day was Christmas, and he invited Josephine and Hortense to visit him at Trianon. He kept them for dinner, and according to Eugène, who was also present, he was very good and very amiable to her, and she seemed to feel much better. The next morning the Emperor wrote: "I retired last night as soon as you left. I want to know that you are gay. I will come to see you during the week. I have received your letters, which I will read in my carriage." In fact, he was returning to the Tuileries after an absence of 10 days, and this was another trial for him and for Josephine. The day after his arrival he writes: "I was much bored at seeing the Tuileries again. This large palace seemed empty to me, and I find myself very lonesome in it." The same evening he writes again: "I much desire to go to Malmaison, but you must be strong and calm." He adds: "I am going to dine all alone." In other letters written during the last week in December, the Emperor promises Josephine to come to see her to morrow. But one day he is retained by the Council until 8 o'clock, at which hour he dines alone. The next day, Sunday, there is a grand review of the Old Guard in the court of the Tuileries, and he is unable to come, after Mass, as he had proposed. Napoleon begins to find Malmaison too far away for frequent visits in midwinter, and wearied of his lonely dinners, he conceives the idea of having her nearer him in Paris. But there is no abode vacant. He had given her the Élysée for a town house, but after the departure of the King of Saxony, the Murats had at once taken possession, on the 17th of December. Their stay was supposed to be only temporary, but Caroline found the palace so comfortable, and was so delighted to keep Josephine out, that she planned to prolong her occupancy as much as possible, and sent out invitations for a masked ball and other entertainments. However, the palace was formally promised Josephine for the first week in January, and she took good care to have the promise renewed by the Emperor when he came, although ill, to wish her a happy New Year. But Josephine wished not only to move to the Élysée, but to assure her continued occupancy of the palace, and she now made a move which has often puzzled her biographers. On the first day of January, 1810, she sent an invitation to Madame de Metternich, the wife of the former Austrian ambassador, to visit her at Malmaison. Much surprised at this summons, the lady came on the following day. In the salon she found Eugène, who seemed to expect her, and in a few minutes Hortense entered. Madame de Metternich was almost stupefied when Hortense greeted her with the words: "You know, madame, that we are all Austrians at heart, but you would never imagine that my mother has had the courage to advise the Emperor to ask for the hand of your Archduchess." Before Madame de Metternich had time to recover from her astonishment, Josephine herself appeared. "I have a project," she said, "which occupies me exclusively, the success of which alone gives me hope that the sacrifice I have just made will not be entirely lost. This is that the Emperor shall marry your Archduchess. I spoke of the matter to him yesterday, and he replied that his decision was not yet entirely made; but I am certain that it would be, if he were sure of being accepted by you." Madame de Metternich replied that personally she should regard such an alliance as a great piece of good fortune; but with the thought of Marie Antoinette in her mind, she could not refrain from adding that it might be painful for an Austrian Archduchess to come to reside in France. Josephine continued: "We must endeavor to arrange all this. You must make your Emperor see that his ruin and that of his country are certain if he does not consent, and that it is the only means of preventing the Emperor from creating a schism with the Holy See." Josephine concluded by saying that the Emperor was coming to breakfast with her, and that she would again speak to him on the subject. At that time Josephine had no connections with the Russian court, and no acquaintance with the Czar Alexander, who later was so devoted to her. She felt that on that side she had nothing to hope and everything to fear. But her feeling for Austria was entirely different. Since the time of her first visit to Italy in 1796, she had been on very friendly terms with the Archduke Ferdinand, the brother of the Emperor. After the peace of Campo Formio she had received from the Emperor himself handsome presents, in recognition of the friendly feelings which animated her. She had always been on confidential terms also with Metternich. She felt sure, therefore, that her Austrian connections would never fail her. This is the explanation of what would seem otherwise a very strange move on her part. Metternich, who had recently been recalled to Vienna to take the portfolio of foreign affairs, wrote his wife at Paris in reply to her communication regarding Josephine's project: "This princess has recently given proofs of a force of character which must greatly increase the feeling of veneration with which not only France but all Europe has long regarded her." In the meantime the Emperor does not fail in his attentions to his former wife. Every day that he cannot visit her, he sends her a letter. He is interested in all her acts; he is rejoiced if she takes a walk or is diverted in any way. The first week in January, after a long call the previous day, he writes: "Sunday, 8 p.m., 7 January, 1810. It gave me very great pleasure to see you yesterday. I realize what a charm your company has for me. I have worked to day with Estève. I have granted 100,000 francs for 1810 for the extraordinary expenses of Malmaison. You can therefore plant as much as you please. You will employ this sum as you wish. I have charged Estève to remit 200,000 francs also as soon as the contract for the Julien house is closed. I have ordered that your set of rubies be settled for as soon as they are appraised by the administration, as I do not wish any robbery by the jewelers. All that costs me 400,000 francs. I have ordered that the million due you from the civil list for 1810 shall be held at the disposal of your man of affairs to pay your debts. You should find in the armoire at Malmaison 500 to 600,000 francs. You can take them to pay for your silver and linen. I have commanded for you a very handsome set of porcelain. They will take your orders, that it may be very fine. Napoleon. During the first month that Josephine was at Malmaison, the Emperor wrote her every day or two, and went to see her several times a week. After that, both his letters and his calls became more and more infrequent. He was gradually becoming accustomed to his lonely dinners and his solitary nights. Josephine, for her part, was daily getting more and more bored at Malmaison and anxious to return to Paris. She had Napoleon's promise, and she did not hesitate to remind him of it. On the 28th of January he writes, "I have had your belongings here arranged, and given orders to take everything to the Élysée." 2 days later he says, "I shall be pleased to know that you are at the Élysée, and very happy to see you oftener, for you know how much I love you." But Josephine began to have her doubts. There were rumors of exile, of a prohibition of her residence in Paris. She took alarm, and sent Eugène to see the Emperor. Napoleon defended himself in 2 letters, written probably on the 6th and 10th of February. Tuesday noon, 6 February, 1810. "I learn that you are worried. That is all wrong. You are without confidence in me, and are affected by all the reports which are noised around. This shows your ignorance of me, Josephine. I am vexed with you, and if I do not learn that you are gay and contented, I shall go and scold you well. Adieu, mon ami. Napoleon." Saturday, 6 P.M., 10 February, 1810. "I have told Eugène that you preferred to listen to the gossip of a great city rather than what I said to you; that people should not be permitted to annoy you with idle tales. I have had your effects transported to the Élysée. You shall come to Paris very soon. But be calm and contented, and have entire confidence in me. Napoleon." M. Masson, who places the date of this last letter a week earlier, says, "The same evening Josephine was installed at the Élysée, and the Emperor came immediately to see her." But this seems to be an error. In the collection of Queen Hortense we find the following letter, No. 209: "To the Empress at Malmaison, Sunday, 9 o'clock, ? 11 February, 1810. "Mon ami, I was very glad to see you day before yesterday. I hope to go to Malmaison during the week. I have had your affairs here arranged, and ordered everything taken to the Élysée Napoleon. I pray you keep well. Adieu, mon ami. Napoleon." On Tuesday, the 20th February, the Emperor, after hunting in the woods of Versailles, attended a fête given by Marshal Bessières at Grignon. From there he went to Rambouillet, and returned to Paris at 6 o'clock on the evening of Friday, the 23rd February. It was apparently just prior to this absence that Josephine moved to Paris, as will appear from the 2 following letters: "To the Empress at the Élysée Napoleon, 19 February, 1810. "Mon ami, I have received your letter. I wish to see you, but your reflections may be correct. There are, perhaps, some objections to our finding ourselves under the same roof during the first year. However, the country place of Bessières is too distant to be able to return. Besides, I have a slight cold, and am not sure to go there. Adieu, mon ami. Napoleon." Friday, 6 P.M., 23rd February, 1810. "Savary has handed me your letter on my arrival. I notice with regret that you are sad. I am glad that you saw no signs of the fire. I had fine weather at Rambouillet. Hortense tells me that you had planned to come to dine with Bessières and return to Paris to sleep. I regret that you were not able to carry out your project. Adieu, mon ami. Be gay. Think that this is the way to please me. Napoleon." In the collection of Queen Hortense the earlier letters of Napoleon to Josephine, almost without exception, are fully dated; but those written after the divorce usually give only the day of the week. This makes the task of arrangement in many cases very difficult. In this instance, however, it is manifest that the letter dated 19 February, which the editors place last, was written before the departure of the Emperor for Rambouillet, and the letter dated Friday 6 p.m. was written after his return. It is also evident that Josephine did not move to Paris until after the middle of February. 30. 1810. The Château of Navarre. From the time that the divorce of Josephine was first officially discussed, at the Erfurt Conference in the autumn of 1808, Napoleon's preference seems to have been for an alliance with the imperial family of Russia. The replies of the Tsar to the overtures of Talleyrand at that time had been equally vague and discreet, but a week after his return home his elder sister Catherine had been affianced to the heir of the Duchy of Oldenburg. During the following year the time of the Emperor was taken up with the campaigns in Spain and Austria, and the matter remained in abeyance. But his thoughts still turned to Russia, and on the 22nd November 1809, a week before the formal notification to Josephine, he instructed Champagny, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to send a despatch to Caulaincourt, the French ambassador at St. Petersburg, directing him to ask the Tsar to state frankly whether he would consider favorably an alliance between the Emperor and his younger sister Anne. At that time it took 2 weeks for a courier to go from Paris to St. Petersburg, and a month later no reply had yet been received from Russia. Another month passed, and Napoleon's patience was exhausted. After Mass on Sunday the 28th of January, 1810, the Emperor called a meeting of the principal dignitaries of the Empire, to discuss the respective advantages and disadvantages of a matrimonial alliance with Austria, Russia, or Saxony. Prince Eugène, Talleyrand, Champagny, Berthier, and Maret declared for the Archduchess Marie Louise; Murat and Cambacérès for the Grand Duchess Anne; while only Lebrun favored the daughter of the King of Saxony. Napoleon took no part in the discussion, and gave no indication of his preference. Finally, on the 6th February, a despatch was received from Caulaincourt. He stated that he had not yet succeeded in obtaining a definite answer from the Tsar, but added that Anne, who was only 15, was not yet of an age to marry, and furthermore that she was not willing to change her religion. Napoleon hesitated no longer. He immediately sent a messenger to inquire of the Austrian ambassador, Prince de Schwarzenberg, whether the marriage contract with the Archduchess Marie Louise could be signed the next day. The contract, which was accordingly signed as proposed, was an almost exact copy of that of Marie Antoinette 40 years before. The marriage by procuration was celebrated at Vienna on the 11th of March, the Archduke Charles representing the Emperor Napoleon. On the 23rd March Marie Louise crossed the Rhine at Strasbourg, and 4 days later reached Compiègne, where Napoleon had been awaiting her arrival for a week. The court left Compiègne on the 30th of March and arrived at St. Cloud the same evening. Here the civil marriage was celebrated on Sunday, the 1st of April. The religious ceremony was performed in Paris the following day by Cardinal Fesch, and took place in the Salon Carré of the Louvre, which had been transformed into a chapel for the occasion. In the meantime, Josephine at the Élysée was finding her life in Paris as monotonous as it had been at Malmaison. The capital had never been so gay. Every night there were dinners, balls, suppers, but the Empress Josephine was not present. The Emperor attended the opera, the theatres. He even gave in the former apartments of the Empress at the Tuileries a performance by the troupe of the Théâtre Feydeau. There were balls given by Schwarzenberg, Talleyrand, Pauline, Berthier, Cambacérès, but in the midst of all these gaieties, Josephine passed her evenings quietly at home. The Emperor had completely changed his habitudes, and seemed to be in training for his life with a young wife. In place of the former tragedies he demanded comedies to amuse him. He hunted in the Bois de Boulogne, at Saint Germain, and at Satory. From time to time he paid a brief visit to Josephine, but his letters had almost entirely ceased. In the centre of Paris, Josephine felt as though she were marooned on a desert island. After passing only a few weeks at the Élysée, on the 9th of March Josephine returned to Malmaison. It is not definitely known whether she tired of her isolation in the capital, or whether she received a delicate hint that her absence would be appreciated during the coming fête in honor of the arrival of the new Empress. The very day that the marriage contract with Marie Louise was signed, the Emperor had taken up the matter of finding a suitable country residence for Josephine, one not too far from Paris, but at the same time more distant than Malmaison, which was almost at the gates of the city. His choice finally fell on the old Château of Navarre, near Evreux, about 70 miles west of Paris. It will be recalled that this property had been assigned to the Prince of the Asturias in May, 1808, as a part of the bargain for the crown of Spain, but the agreement had never been carried out, and the following January, by a decree of the Emperor, the land of Navarre had been added to the domain of the state. This château owed its name to Jeanne of France, Queen of Navarre, who, about the middle of the 14th century, had erected the building on the site of an old manor house. 300 years later the property was ceded by Louis XIV. To the Duc de Bouillon in exchange for the sovereignty of Sedan, and remained in the possession of that family up to the time of the Revolution. By a curious coincidence, it was one of the cadet members of this same family who built at Paris the hotel which later became the Palace of the Élysée. During the Revolution the property was confiscated, and had later been joined to the Crown lands, although the title was far from clear. It was also very doubtful whether the Emperor had the power now to alienate the property from the Crown domain, and present it to a private person. But after certain formalities more or less legal had been complied with, the Emperor directed Maret to prepare letters patent erecting the land of Navarre into a duchy, and conveyed the title and the revenues to Josephine for her life. In a letter to the Empress at Malmaison, Napoleon tells her of this gift. Paris, 12 March, 1810. Mon ami, I hope that you have been satisfied with what I have done for Navarre. You will have seen in this act a new proof of my desire to be agreeable to you. Take possession of Navarre. You might go there the 25th of March to pass the month of April. Adieu, mon ami. Napoleon. This letter of the Emperor was in effect an order, which admitted of no evasion. The date of her departure and the length of her exile were both fixed. The 19th of March, the day of St. Joseph, was her fête, but it was very quietly celebrated this year. The following day Eugène was to arrive with his wife, whom she had not seen since their marriage at Munich 4 years before. They came to spend a week at Malmaison, and thus Josephine found an excuse to defer her departure for a few days longer. She had already stayed 3 days beyond the limit fixed by the Emperor. The new Empress was at Compiègne, and expected in Paris by the end of the week. It was time to start, and Josephine went into her first exile. Late in the afternoon of Thursday, the 29th of March, Josephine made her triumphal entry into Evreux. She was received by the mayor, the prefect, and the authorities with a band of music and a guard of honor. The church bells were rung, and there were salvos of artillery. Josephine did not stop in the city, but proceeded directly to Navarre, where she arrived at nightfall. The first view of the château was very disappointing. It was a huge 2-storied square block, surrounded by a dome upon which one of the original owners had intended to set up a statue of his uncle, the great Turenne. At the side of the château stood a smaller house. Both alike were dilapidated, draughty, and unfurnished, in spite of the fact that for 2 weeks past all of the laborers available at Evreux had worked to make in haste the most necessary repairs. The unfinished and uncrowned dome, which gave a ludicrous appearance to the building, was irreverently termed the Marmite by the Normans of the neighborhood. The rooms were vast and chilly, the windows would not close, the roof leaked, and the chimneys smoked. The château's situation in a valley, while giving from the windows beautiful views of wooded hills in the summer, made it very damp for the rest of the year. On all sides there were large bodies of water, with cascades and fountains; and the park was planted with magnificent trees, but at the end of March the leaves are rare, and between the water which flows, the water which stagnates, and the water which falls, with for companions these black skeletons, denuded and oozing, it would require to be pleased a backing of gaiety which Josephine did not bring with her. A few days after her arrival, Josephine wrote Hortense, who was at Compiègne with the court. Navarre, 3rd April, 1810. I arrived here in good health, my dear Hortense, although somewhat tired from the journey. I was depressed by the greeting I received. The inhabitants of Evreux have displayed much enthusiasm over my arrival, but this appearance of a fête somewhat resembled the compliments of condolence. The Emperor is happy, he deserves to be, and he will be more and more. This thought is a great consolation for me, and the only one which sustains my courage. Navarre will become a very fine residence, but it demands many repairs and expenditures. Absolutely everything needs to be done over. The château is not habitable. The persons whom I have brought with me have each only a small room, of which the door and the windows do not close. My lodging is also very small and ill arranged, and the woodwork is in bad order. The park is magnificent. It is in a large valley between two hills planted with the most beautiful trees. But there is too much water, which makes the place damp and unhealthy. One should live at Navarre during the months of May, June, July, and the beginning of August. Then it is the most enchanting spot to be found anywhere. At the present season Malmaison would be preferable to me. My life here is that of the country. I go out for a walk or a drive when it does not rain. In the evening I have a game of backgammon with the Bishop of Evreux, who is very agreeable, in spite of his 75 years. The time passes slowly, but it will seem shorter to me when you are here. I look for you impatiently. Your rooms are ready. They are not handsome. You will only camp out. But you know with what tenderness you will be received. Adieu, my dear daughter. I embrace you. If the Emperor asks you for news of me, tell him, what is true, that my only occupation is thinking of him. Josephine. In a letter to her husband at Compiègne, written early in April, Madame de Rémusat says: "There are many tales here at Paris regarding the court and the life you lead there. In general, all these inventions are unkind. They all tend to show the hauteur of the manners of the Empress and the brusqueness of her character. Then every one recalls the other, and that will make her position difficult. They say that she will only be Duchesse de Navarre; that she will be relegated to the Duchy of Berg; that Malmaison will be bought back from her; that our new sovereign has displayed a great aversion to seeing her so near, and in support of that assertion they cite words clearly invented, for it is impossible that they should have been repeated. I await your return to know the truth." As Madame de Rémusat was a great friend of Josephine, these rumors undoubtedly reached her at Navarre, and increased her anxiety to return to Malmaison. The Emperor had not written her since his marriage, and she looked upon his silence as a proof of his intention to abandon her entirely. She feared to write him direct, but through Eugène asked permission to return to Malmaison. The reply being favourable, Josephine wrote the letter which follows: Navarre, 10 April, 1810. Sire, I have received through my son the assurance that your Majesty consents to my return to Malmaison, and is willing to grant me the advances which I have asked for to render the château of Navarre habitable. This double favour, sire, goes far to drive away the great anxiety and even fear inspired by your Majesty's long silence. I was afraid of being banished entirely from your remembrance. I see now that I am not. I am therefore less unhappy, and even as happy as it is possible for me to be henceforward. I shall go to Malmaison at the end of the month, since your Majesty sees no objection to this. My plan is to stay there for a very short time. I shall soon take my departure to go to the waters. But during my stay at Malmaison, your Majesty may be sure that I shall live there as if I were 1,000 leagues away from Paris. I have made a great sacrifice, sire, and every day I more appreciate its magnitude. This sacrifice, however, shall be all it ought to be. It shall be complete on my part. Your Majesty shall not be troubled in the midst of your happiness by any expression of my regrets. May I have always a little place in your remembrance, and a large place in your esteem and friendship. This will soften my grief without compromising, it seems to me, that which is of the highest importance, the happiness of your Majesty, Josephine. This letter does not seem to merit either the severe criticism of some of the biographers or the eulogy of others. Turcan declares it to be totally lacking in dignity, with its irritating reiteration of the sacrifices she had made, and its demand for money. On the other hand, Saint Amand considers it to be "an eloquent and simple expression of a true and noble sentiment, in which humility and dignity are perfectly combined." And Masson says: "In truth, this letter is a masterpiece, in which is to be found everything to excite the memory of Napoleon, arouse his former affection, and awaken his pity." The best comment on this letter, however, is to be found in the reply of the Emperor: Compiègne, 21st April, 1810. Mon ami, I am in receipt your letter of the 19 April. It is in bad form. de mauvais style. I am always the same. Men like myself never change. I cannot imagine what Eugène told you. I have not written you because you have not written, and because I wished in every way to be agreeable to you. I am glad to know that you are going to Malmaison, and that you will be contented. I shall be pleased to hear from you, and to respond. I shall not say more until you have had a chance to compare this letter with your own. After that I leave you to decide which is the better friend, you or myself. Adieu, mon ami. Take care of yourself, and be just, both to yourself and to me. Napoleon. This letter is written with the old familiar tutoiement, so difficult to render into English, which is employed by Napoleon in all his letters to Josephine. We think that the reader will agree that her letter showed bad form, was unwarranted in its assumptions, and that Napoleon on this, as on many other occasions, proved himself the better friend. Josephine's reply merits quotation in full. Navarre, no date. 1,000 loving thanks for not having forgotten me. My son has just brought me your letter. With what eagerness I read it, and yet I spent plenty of time in doing so, for there was not a word of it which did not make me weep. But these tears were very sweet. I have got back my heart entirely, and it will always be as it is now. Certain feelings are life itself, and can only finish with life. I should be in despair if my letter of the 19th had displeased you. I do not remember its exact wording, but I know how painful was the feeling which dictated it, the sorrow of not hearing from you. I wrote you at the time of my departure from Malmaison, and since then how many times have I not wished to write to you! But I knew the reason for your silence, and I feared to importune you by a letter. Yours has been a balm to me. Be happy, be as happy as you deserve. It is my whole heart which speaks to you. You have just given me my share of happiness, and a share which I appreciate to the full. Nothing to me can be worth so much as a proof of your remembrance. Adieu, mon ami. I thank you as tenderly as I shall always love you. Josephine. This letter is very sweet and tender, but somehow it does not ring true. Masson says if it is sincere it is maladroit. But if she is playing a rôle, knowing her partner as she does, is it not adroit in the highest degree? In answer to her letter, Napoleon wrote briefly from Compiègne on the 28th of April, encouraging her to go to the waters, and assuring her once more of his unchanged feelings. He, too, had evidently heard of the rumours spoken of by Madame de Rémusat, for he said in his letter, "Do not listen to the babble of Paris, they are idle and far from knowing the truth." In fact, there was not the slightest foundation for the reports. Napoleon showed himself most willing to fall in with Josephine's plans for the remainder of the year and the following winter. She wished to go first to Malmaison, then, at the end of May, to some watering place for 3 months. After that she proposed to proceed to the south of France, Florence, Rome, and Naples; to spend the winter with Eugène in Milan, and return in the spring to Malmaison and Navarre. The Emperor did not offer to meet the expenses of the repairs at Navarre, but agreed to advance the 600,000 francs left, after payment of her debts, out of her allowance from the Crown Treasury for 1810 and 1811; also that the 100,000 francs allowed her for extraordinary expenses at Malmaison should be diverted to Navarre. The middle of May, Josephine returned to Malmaison, then in all its spring glory. For the first time she is able to enjoy her hyacinths and tulips imported from Holland, for, as she once complained, "Bonaparte always summons me to him just at the moment they are in flower." Chapters 29 and 30